Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. I'm a 1979 graduate of the law school, and I am the dean of students, actually, at the law school. So I consider myself to be the middle of the sandwich. The dean of admissions tries to get the best group together we can. The dean of career services tries to help people follow their dreams and get a job when they get out of law school. And sort of everything that happens in the middle is what I need to deal with as the dean of students. And I want to share with you a story that I've started every orientation speech with since I started in 2005 as the dean of students. It's the first day of orientation. You're the law students. I'm looking at you, and I start off with the fact that there's this old man in China. And he's got a horse. It's his wealth. He rides it to work. He rides it to the village. And suddenly, one day, the horse runs away. And all the villagers come to the old man in China, and they say, "Oh, such bad fortune, you've lost your horse." And the old man looks at them, and he says, "Good news? Bad news? Who's to say?" Well, a couple of weeks later, the horse comes back. He's got 6 wild horses with him. Suddenly, the old man's a wealthy man. All the villagers come to him. They say, "Oh, man, such good fortune. Now you're a wealthy man. You have 7 horses." And the old man says, "Good news, bad news, who's to say?" Well, then his only son breaks his leg trying to train one of those horses. And suddenly, all the villagers come to him and say, "Oh, such bad fortune, your honorable son, he's broken his leg." And the old man says, "Good news, bad news, who's to say?" Well, then the warlord in this region goes to war with the neighboring region, and he conscripts all the able-bodied young men. They go off to fight in the war. Most of them are killed. Of course, he can't take the son because he has the broken leg, and all the villagers come to the old man, and they say, "Oh, man, such bad fortune. Good fortune. Your son has been spared the war." And of course, the old man looks at them, and he says, "Good news, bad news, who's to say?" And I look at that crowd of eager faces, and I say, "So this is your first day at SMU Dedman School of Law, and I'm your dean of students. Good news? Bad news? Who's to say?" And it's become kind of a mantra. It's a perspective. It's looking at what happens and realizing we don't know the rest of the story. And when students come to me with problems because they have problems, I try to help them realize that we're never powerless, that we always have the ability. And I do that coming from a place that I came from. I learned the lesson very early in my life that life wasn't fair. I think we get upset when life doesn't give us what we want. And yes, this good news, bad news story is about perspective, what's going to happen in the future, but it's also about the fact that life isn't fair. Sometimes good things happen to bad people. Sometimes bad things happen to good people. Sometimes things come to us that we don't deserve, either good or bad. Now, when I was about 6 years old, I thought I had figured out the way the world worked, what was fair, what wasn't fair. I think I was probably always wired to be a lawyer because I had this mind that balanced things, and I wanted a kite. I'd saved up my money, and I wanted to go to a kite. There's a store in Oklahoma City where we were living at the time called TEDx, named after the owners of the store, although ostensibly we said it was turtles and girdles and yo-yos, right? And so I asked my dad to let me go to TEDx, and he said, "Son, I don't have time right now." That was a dilemma for me because I wanted that. And I wasn't allowed to cross this busy street. But I didn't want to wait till he would take me. So I started thinking, well, what's going to happen if I disobey? I disobeyed before, and I realized if I disobey, I will probably get a spanking. But I had survived spankings before. So off I go. I cross the road. I go and I buy my kite. I successfully cross the road again. And I'm almost 2 blocks from my house, and my father pulls up in the car and says, "Get in, son." Now, if I had just been quiet, if I had just been able to sit there, maybe I would have worked it all out. But instead, I looked at him. I said, "Dad, I'm sorry. I know I disobeyed." He said, "Yes, you did." I said, "And I know I'm going to get a spanking, but at least I got my kite." And he looked at me and he said, "Son, you're half right. You are going to get a spanking. You're just not going to get to keep the kite." Suddenly I realized, wow, maybe I don't know how the world works. Maybe life isn't really fair. But I also learned another thing as a child, and that is what I call the blessings of a difficult childhood. If you have a difficult childhood, then somehow when life throws other things at you in your life, which it will do, you're better able to cope with it. I see sometimes students come into my office and they didn't have any problems before the first time they weren't in the top of their class, and it knocks them down. We were so poor when I was growing up that my mother used to make this thing called fry bread for dinner sometime, and it was in a big cast iron skillet, and it was this really tasty bread, and it was like a donut, and she put cinnamon and sugar on it, and I always thought that was the treat. We got to have fry bread tonight. Till one day I realized when I was an adult that the reason she made fry bread was because all she had in the house was flour and water and sugar. And that was why we had that. We moved into a 3-room duplex when I was in about 6th grade. And I was looking for where's the rest of the house. There was a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen. There were holes in the floor of the linoleum, which I used as little islands to play with my Army men. I slept in a bed with my brother. My mother and father slept in the other bed. And then tragedy really struck when I was 15. My mom took her life. I was going to a small school, Catholic school. There were 26 in my class. I'd just been elected vice president of the student council. That was my world. My mother was gone. My father was a salesman. He was gone most of the time. I was on my own. And then the priest, who was the principal, comes to me and says, Martin, I have to tell you something, and I'm sorry. I know you're a good student. I know you're a leader, but your dad didn't pay tuition. You're going to have to pay tuition not only for the sophomore year this year, but for your junior year if you want to come back. Wow. Now, I had a choice. At that moment in time, I had a choice. I could get angry at the world. I could get mad. It's the early into the 60s. I could go use drugs. I have all the excuses anybody would ever want to have. But I said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to find a way to make this work. And I went and got a job at a Whataburger. And I had a checklist of life, the dreams. I wanted to go to college. My parents hadn't gone to college. I wanted to go to law school because I had seen lawyers that were leaders. I wanted to have a family. I wanted to raise children. I've got 3 children now. My son went to the law school here. My daughter's an undergraduate, graduate, and my youngest son got a degree in psychology and sings the blues. So what did I learn from all that? I learned a couple of things. One was we're not powerless. And I tell my students when they come in with a problem, I say, look, you can ask the why question one time. It's helpful. It gives us context. Why did this happen? Then you have to stop. Don't beat yourself up. It doesn't really matter. Then you have to ask the only question that does matter, which is, what am I going to do now about this? Because you see, there's only 2 things in life we really have any control over, at least from my opinion. It's our own actions, and it's our own attitude about what happens to us. So it's in this action and it's taking the attitude that power is restored. We're not powerless. Now, this good news, bad news story, there was a student, Nefertarius McPherson, an amazing woman, African-American woman. She worked with Ron Kirk, our first African-American mayor. After that, she worked in his senatorial campaign. When he wasn't elected, she came to the law school, and she was in our evening program, and amazing. Everybody loved her. She would walk in the room. It would light the room up. She was a student leader, and tragedy struck. The bad news. Her mother had a stroke. And Nefertarius developed a very severe liver condition. She had to go back and forth in the Mayo Clinic several times while she was in law school. But she always persevered through that, and when she graduated, she received an award from the students, the Kennedy Award, which is given after one of our professors for who's a student leader who's really made a difference where they were. But it affected her grades because she was not able to apply herself the way she would have before. And so after she graduated, she struggled to get a good job. She came and she sat on that comfortable couch, and she looked at me. She said, Dean Camp, I can't understand. Why is it I can't get a good job? I've got friends. I've always been successful. And I looked at her and I said, Neffy, I don't know why. I just feel like there's something about the election of President Obama that's going to change your life. I don't know why. Well, guess what? President Obama hired Ron Kirk to be his Undersecretary of Commerce. He hired Nefertarius to be his spokesperson. That Christmas, I get a postcard from her. She's traveled all over the world. She's got a picture of her by the pyramids. And she comes to see me at graduation the next year. She says, Dean Camp, you remember that good news, bad news story? You know, if I had had that good job right out of law school, I wouldn't have even been available to take this job. And, you know, she's right. And then the bad news comes again, and the liver disease comes back. And she has to have a liver transplant. The good news is she gets a liver transplant. And she calls me up and she says, you know, Dean Camp, if I didn't have this job with the government that had such great health care, I don't know how I would have gotten this. I don't know how I would have paid for it. It was so expensive. But 100% of it was paid for because I had a government job. So then she became a spokesperson for transplants. She traveled all over the country. She's interviewed all over the country. She rode this year in the Rose Parade, representing organizations that help put donors together and support organ donations. She was selected, and just a couple of months ago, she received a recognition from the SMU undergrad, because she's an undergrad also, as one of the most distinguished African-American leaders who were alumni. 39 years old, amazing woman. I was going to call Neffy and tell her I was going to use her story in this TED Talk. And the day I was going to call her, I got a text message from a friend. She was in the hospital. And she died. She had very aggressive stomach cancer, nothing to do with any of these other problems, and it took her life. And it sent me for a loop, and I thought to myself, life isn't fair. Good news. Bad. Why does this have to happen? Why is somebody like this who's made such a difference, why are they taken away? I went to her funeral. It was at a large church. It was glorious. It was a celebration. It was filled with all these people she'd touched in her life, and I realized, Nefertirius learned in the hardships that she experienced that every day was precious, that we live each day as it's our last, and that we make a difference. And I thought of another Chinese proverb. It says, if you want to have immortality in your life, you plant a tree, you have a child, you write a book. Why? Well, those are things that survive after we leave this world. And I thought, no, we need to add something else to that. If you want to have immortality, you have a life of meaning. You have a life that impacts people. You have a life that makes a difference. And that's what Nefertirius, Akili, McPherson taught me. That's a lesson that I think my life has taught myself, that I try to share with all of my students. And that's the life that I want to lead, and that's the life that I wish for every single one of you. I'm so happy to have had a chance to come back. I love this place. I love this school. Thank you for giving me a chance to share my story.